It's time for the Bible Geek.
We don't really know for sure what is and what is not.
Holy Ghost.
God, agnostic. God, blasphemous.
Ghost.
Yes, friends, it's time for the Bible Geek. Interpretation. Historical. Jesus. Homiletical. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
It's the Bible Geek here, and still watching horror movies as we count down to that day of days, Halloween. And last night saw a great Mexican Gothic Invasion of the Vampires. Oh, what a classic. And let's see, I want to just remind you that I do actually have copies of Moses and Minimalism for $20 a piece with an autograph by the geek himself, or myself, or whatever the heck it is. And with that, I want to get into some questions. I know that's a big surprise. And let's just scroll up to the top. Sorry about that. And see them. Okay. This is from the great Michael Lockwood. He says, in Wednesday's discussion, you mentioned various explanations for that most peculiar passage in Matthew 27, 51, 53, the zombies. But you've overlooked what I consider the most satisfying explanation of all, the very short notice by Christian Lintner in his news bulletin of May 19, 2010, in his Jesus is Buddha, the title of which is The Rising of the Saints from the Tombs, the Buddhist Lotus Sutra source of Matthew 27, 51 through 53. And let me read you that. I'm indebted to Michael for pointing that out. I knew about it, but just forgot it. I guess it's senility. This is just a page long. It's not that long. It's fascinating stuff. Lintner says the following: when Jesus gave up his spirit, many odd phenomena occurred. One of these, obviously intended as a sort of evidence for the Christian doctrine of physical resurrection, is mentioned by Matthew 27, 51 through 53. And the earth was shaken, and the rocks were rent, and the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose and came out of the graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city, and appeared to many. The identity of the bodies of these saints who came out of their graves and went into the holy city has always been somewhat of an embarrassment to even the most naive among modern theologians. One learned Danish theologian, Mogens Müller, suggests that the reference is to the prophets and righteous men of the Old Testament. Another theologian, Donald A. Hagner, admits, quote, that the rising of the saints from the tomb in this passage is a piece of theology set forth as history, unquote. To interrupt, poor Mike Lycona got a good whipping for that. Okay, back to Lintner. One cannot but smile at the opposition or conflict between theology and history that Hagner here inadvertently expresses, for what he says is simply that Matthew is not speaking the truth. However, the rising of the saints from the tombs is not merely a case of theology or myth, but a manifest case of plagiarism. We have already seen that the best and the earliest, quote-unquote, evidence for the physical resurrection of Jesus and for Christians in general has been copied by, quote, Paul, unquote, from Buddhist sources, the more than 500 brethren, etc., 1 Corinthians 15, and there's another essay on that. And when it comes to the saints rising from the tombs, we again have a Buddhist source, namely the celebrated Lotus Sutra, the Saddharma Pundarika Kasutram. The Saddharma Pundarika Sutram, still available in Sanskrit as well as Chinese, Tibetan, etc. Chapter 14 of the Sanskrit edition and English translation of H. Kern, chapter 15 of the Chinese version of Kumarajiva, I love those names, translated by W. E. Soothill, is entitled The Issuing of the Bodhisattvas from the Gaps of the Earth. Here are the main points. The multitude of bodhisattvas say to the Lord that they would like to read, write, worship, and devote themselves to the Lotus Sutra, but the Lord, Buddha, replies that this is not necessary, for he already has an enormous number of bodhisattvas able to do that. And here's the quote. No sooner had the Lord uttered these words than the Saha world, the earth, burst open on every side, and from within the clefts arose many 100,000 myriads of kotis, tens of millions, of bodhisattvas with gold-colored bodies, who had been staying in the element of ether underneath this great earth, close to this Saha world. These, then, on hearing the word of the Lord, came up from below the earth. They cannot be numbered, counted, calculated, compared, or known by occult science. These bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, great beings, who emerged from the gaps of the earth to appear in the Saha world. And after they had successfully emerged, they went up to the stupa of precious substances which stood in the sky, where the Lord Prabhu Taratna, a former Tathagata, Buddha, was seated on a throne along with Lord Shakyamuni, Gautama Buddha. Therefore they saluted the feet of both Tathagatas, etc., as well as the images of Tathagatas produced by the Lord Shakyamuni from his own body. Now from the Chinese version of Kumarajiva. When the Buddha has thus spoken, the earth trembles and quakes, and from its midst there issue together innumerable thousands, myriads, kotis, tens of millions, of bodhisattvas, mahasattvas. These bodhisattvas, hearing the voice of Shakyamuni Buddha preaching, sprang forth from below. When these bodhisattvas have emerged from the earth, each goes up to the wonderful stupa of precious substances, jewels, in the sky, where are the Tathagata, abundant treasures, and Shakyamuni Buddha. By the way, I got a framed poster of Shakyamuni Buddha right here on the wall above my set of mummy action figures, I tell you. Conclusion, the saints that issue from the earth are not really the prophets, etc., of the Old Testament, but the bodhisattvas of the Lotus Sutra. The cry of Jesus up there on the cross was the cry of the Lord up there in the stupa in the sky. The holy city to which they went was the stupa up there in the sky. By comparing the original text of the Lotus Sutra, the reader will find many more parallels, all of them to the effect that Matthew, who gets his name from a famous Buddhist monk, and his cohorts copied the Lotus Sutra when they fabricated the legend of Jesus, combining, of course, with bits and pieces taken from the Old Testament, etc. In Chapter 10 of the Lotus Sutra, on the Buddhist preacher, the Lord endorses the stratagem that after his nirvana, passing into it at death, the Lotus Sutra be communicated in secret or by stealth, rahasi karanapis, so on. This is, as we have now seen, indeed what happened when Matthew, quote-unquote, plagiarized the legend of the Lotus Sutra about the bodhisattvas that issued from the earth upon the Lord's cry from the stupa in the sky. In the old wooden church of Granhult in Sweden, there is a painting in the nave showing the physical resurrection of the bodhisattvas. Christian readers will, in the interest of historical truth, be happy to know that all the alleged witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus are, in fact, Buddhist witnesses. Should they not be happy about that, there is some consolation to be had from yet another fact, namely that all the Buddhist witnesses are themselves also not fact, but myth or fabrications of vivid Buddhist imagination. I'm telling you, I don't quite know what to make of it yet, but this Buddhist New Testament stuff, boy, oh boy, is it fascinating. A whole wing of radical criticism. Christian Linder told me if I really wanted to get into gospel origins, I'd have to learn Sanskrit. Not in this lifetime, I'm afraid. Okay. Let's see. Ken says, I hear a lot of claims of Jesus being similar to or a copy of pagan gods, as well as rebuttals from others about these claims. What is your professional opinion of these claims? Well, Ken, I think that this is a classic instance of desperate spin being offered by the spin doctors, the apologists for the Christian faith. The parallels are so obvious with Dionysus, Tammuz, Adonis, Attis, even Hercules, and I mentioned Osiris, and that it's just, you can't retreat to this nonsense argument, oh, really, the differences are more pronounced than the similarities. Get out of here. Do you know what an ideal type is? You just make a list of the salient features different phenomena have in common, with the admission that, of course, the flesh on the same skeleton is going to be different in every case. But once you see that you can neatly put these things into the same category, you start having to ask questions. Have they influenced one another? Is this one borrowed from that one? That is more difficult to show, though in some cases you can. But that's almost irrelevant. The point is, I left out Baal. The point is that this is the same sort of stuff, and when the story of Jesus has so many parallels with what everyone admits are myths, what everyone recognizes as myths, it's just the most outrageous special pleading to say, oh, no, in this one case, it really happened. I like to use the being a geek, as you can tell from this particular episode already. I have always thought you could compare it to superheroes from the comics. Suppose you're reading a bunch of nifty superhero comics, and you got Captain Marvel, the Martian Manhunter, and Superman, and numerous others, and somebody says, well, you know, these others are fictional and phony, but Superman really existed. Why should you think that? I mean, how arbitrary is that? If he's just like the others and we don't see any Superman active, why would you think that? So I think it's just ridiculous. The way some apologists frequently try to explain this away and get out of a tight spot is to say that, the other religions borrowed this stuff from Christianity. That's just demonstrably false. Not only do we have clear evidence in the form of actual documents, the pyramid texts, some of the Rosh Shamra Ugaritic texts, etc., that are older. I mean, the actual copies we have are older than Christianity. And they attest the dying and rising God thing, etc. But one of the main arguments that early Christian apologists like Tertullian used, Justin Martyr, Minucius Felix, I think, was one. I might have the wrong guy there. At any rate, the argument they used was, Satan knew from reading Bible prophecy that God was going to send his son, who would be born of a virgin, do miracles, die, and rise from the dead. Satan knew this was going to happen, so he decided to fabricate these events in story form, to do counterfeits before the fact, so that when it actually happened, this would mislead pagans into saying, yeah, he died and rose from the dead. I've heard that a million times before. What's the difference? This is just another one of the same. You see the problem with this argument? No one would ever offer such an argument if they thought Christians had it first. You wouldn't say that Satan had counterfeited the coming events of the Jesus story in advance, right? That certainly means that these apologists knew good and well and admitted freely that pagans had the stuff first. And I think enough said, really, on that. Okay, here's a question that came up earlier. I want to repeat from James the Jest Vegetarian. He says, could you please comment on cryptomnesia, inadvertent plagiarism, and biblical scholarship? I do not know how you and other scholars can keep straight who came up with what after reading mountains of books. How do you make sure your ideas are original? Well, of course, you've said it. You got to read mountains of books. Once a student, Drew, said to me, how do you, there's so much out there. How do you decide what to read? And I said, well, you got to read everything. You do. I've found a number of places where some scholar proposes something that's already been proposed and refuted decades earlier. People often just don't know the past, but you've got to know it. Otherwise you'll be reinventing the wheel. Of course, it speaks well of you if you have come up with something that you later find scholars have already floated out there, because it means that you're as sharp-eyed as they were. But so it's original with you, but you can't really claim credit for it. Right, it's that there's an important difference there, but it does mean, hey, nice work, nice going. You're pretty sharp-eyed. Professional scholars have already come up with this, and you're just as smart. But again, you don't claim credit for it, as your original observation, even though in a sense it was. So that's just. Like where I assume you mean where you have, the cryptomnesia seems to imply you did read this before, but you've forgotten, and now you are really remembering it, and you think it's occurring to you for the first time. I don't know, but this is a bit different. Anyway, then you go on. Second part of this, it seems to me that Hyam Maccoby, in his first book, Revolution in Judea, in 1973, anticipated some of the central ideas of Robert Eisenman's James the Brother of Jesus, 1996. As far as I know, Eisenman doesn't acknowledge Maccoby. Was this cryptomnesia? Two independent scholarly investigations that happened to converge? I'm going to quote Maccoby at length and tell me what you think. From page 122. Jesus' brethren and kinsmen, quote-unquote for both, are shown as regarding him as a madman and as not believing in him. Yet this cannot be so, for Jesus' brother James became the leader of the movement. The Nazarenes are Jewish Christians immediately after Jesus' death, and another brother, Judas, was also prominent in the Jewish Christian church and is credited with an epistle in the canon of the New Testament. That's like whether he actually wrote it or not, right? That's probably whom Polycarp had in mind. The two brothers were probably members of the 12 during Jesus' lifetime and are to be identified with James the Less and Judas, a.k.a. Thaddeus. This has been suppressed in the Gospels in order to emphasize Jesus' isolation. One thing you have to realize about this whole thing is that it's not just connecting the dots between Eisenman and Maccoby. I don't recall if Eisenman ever actually refers to Maccoby in the work, because largely he's doing his own thing, but there is a larger tradition of scholarship on this issue of James the Just as the brother of Jesus and the leader of the Jewish Christians and so forth, and the possibility that one or both of them were revolutionists in some manner, and this probably goes back to Robert Eisler in the 1920s, who wrote a just endlessly fascinating book called I believe it's The Messiah, Jesus, and John the Baptist. And then there were various others that kind of followed up on that. I think S.G.F. Brandon's book, The Fall of Jerusalem and the Origins of the Christian Church, and then his second one, Jesus and the Zealots. But even earlier than that, you had stuff about the Caliphate of James from Adolf Harnack and Ethelbert Stauffer and others. And there have been various people that have dealt with this. There were even people before Eisenman. I think Jacob Teicher, I believe his name was, wrote a whole series of articles on how the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls were most likely the Jewish Christians of Jerusalem. So this, and Eisenman is aware of all this stuff. He doesn't claim to be an innovator. He's just carrying it forward by looking at some neglected material like the Slavonic Josephus, the Pseudo-Clementines, the various rabbinic legends and stories and so forth. So it isn't just a question of that. Now, a good example of what you're talking about is in this book Zealot by Reza Aslan, where it's as if no one has written on this before, and he seems to think or want you to think that he's come up with it all by his lonesome. I think it's dishonest because he certainly knows the work of Brandon, at least, since he does footnote him, though on a kind of marginal issue. He gives no hint as to what Brandon said about this, namely having come up with the whole thing before Aslan was ever born. And it's very similar, except that Brandon doesn't have the nonsense that Aslan has added to it. So it's really now there's a case of what literary critics call the anxiety of influence, where you want to minimize the degree to which you're dependent on earlier writers because you want to shine out like an innovator. Eisenman is not doing that and acknowledges predecessors in this. He's just carrying the tradition forward. Whether you want to call Aslan case of cryptomnesia, I don't know. I think he's really trying to pull the wool over our eyes, basically. Are there? I recorded answers to several of these questions the other day. Somehow it didn't come through, and I'm having to redo most of yesterday's podcast, so I just have my summary to work from, so I no longer know who said what, but at least let's get through the questions. Somebody asks if I have any thoughts on whether there are indisputable data about the historical Jesus. And we discussed yesterday at a bit more length than I'm willing to do again today how the supposed solid rocks of the baptism of Jesus and the crucifixion of Jesus were undeniable bedrocks for the historical Jesus, and how I don't think they are. And there are big reasons for doubting that. I get into some of that in my books. But in terms of the positive thing here, I would say that there is no indisputable minimum data about a historical Jesus, but I will say the closest thing, the thing that to me is the most important evidence on the side of a historical Jesus is what I just talked about, the Caliphate of James. The fact that it seems like, and though this comes from spotty, patchy sources too, this notion that Jesus was succeeded by his brother James and then by his brother Simeon as the heads of the Jerusalem church, that does sound an awful lot like what's happened with the Mormons and the Nation of Islam and so forth, these succession disputes. And so by the principle of analogy, that is rendered quite plausible, and with it the historical Jesus as at the root of it. Implying that Jesus was understood to be some sort of revolutionary king. And as Brandon showed real well, there's all kinds of hints that Mark has tried to paper over this to curry favor with the Romans, or at least avert their persecution. I've said before that if there was a historical Jesus, my guess is that Eisler and Brandon have got him. But, there's even that's pretty tenuous. Okay, here's a really fascinating one. When Luke borrows the story of Jacob and Esau striving in the womb, using it in his episode in the Nativity story, where the newly pregnant Mary visits her cousin Elizabeth, who's been pregnant for half a year, with John the Baptist, and as soon as she sees Mary appear in the doorway, she says, the babe within me leaped in the womb at the approach of the mother of my Lord. So the fetus John the Baptist is acknowledging the superior messianic character of his cousin still in the womb, hardly even there yet, namely Jesus. And it is certainly based on this thing in Genesis where where Rebecca says that she's got the twins struggling or leaping or striving in the womb. And the idea there is that they're contesting for primacy. Who's going to be the firstborn? And that's the first of about 3 different versions of the forfeiture of the blessing of the firstborn by Esau and his yielding it to or it being usurped by Jacob. And that's what's going on here, though we usually hear from scholars who understand this that's what Luke's getting at, that here the old rivalry gives way to a harmonious acknowledgement of the greater character of the younger, in this case of the 2 cousins. But the questioner said, wouldn't it be better to follow this out to the whole parallel and to see this having this applying to the rivalry between the movements of John the Baptist and Jesus? Luke certainly knows about this. He's trying to patch things up, that's for sure. But don't we have to see that here too, the Jacob and Esau in the womb story is reflecting the fact that the older will serve the younger, that the younger, Jesus, will usurp the primacy rightfully due to John the Baptist and temporarily enjoyed by him. Same thing comes up in the Gospel of John when John the Baptist says of Jesus, "He who comes after me was before me." It's the same sort of thing. Who's got the priority? Fascinating. That's really an excellent insight. Let's see. We have a question that's come up before, and I've certainly chewed it over and thought about it before. Why isn't Jesus named Emmanuel? Because, of course, in Matthew's nativity story, the angel says to Joseph that the messianic infant will be called, in accord with the prophet Isaiah, Emmanuel. God is with us. And, of course, he's not called Emmanuel. And why not? Why do they name him Jesus if he's told to name him Emmanuel? Or why didn't Matthew chop that part out of the prophecy, since he knows he's not going to have a character named Emmanuel of Nazareth. And the questioner said that he'd heard evasive attempts to say, well, naming him Emmanuel isn't literally what they meant. It's like coming in the spirit and power of Emmanuel. Get out of here. I think it remains a mystery, though there are scholars like Richard Carrier, David Oliver Smith, and others who have said, well, you see, this is supposed to be the point that anticipates, in the beginning, that anticipates the counterpoint at the end of the gospel, where Jesus sends the disciples on their world evangelism mission. He said, I will be with you till the consummation of the age. So Emmanuel, God is with us, and at the end, I will be with you. Now, I think, and this gets into this larger thing about Matthew being structured as a vast chiasm, where the two halves of the gospel mirror one another, etc. Well, that seems likely to me, and I do see the correspondence there, but that really does not answer why Matthew has him named Emmanuel. I mean, certainly he could have worded it differently. This sounds like, just like in Luke, you will name him Jesus. And why? So I don't think that really is an adequate answer, though it appears to be true as far as it goes. Just doesn't go far enough. Let's see. I remember John Felix asked this one. I'm wondering if you've ever heard of any scholar suggesting that the Acts of the Apostles was redacted from a shorter Acts of Paul written by Marcion or Marcionites. Well, not exactly, but I think there's something very similar to this. I know of two scholars. Of course, one was the great W.C. van Manen, the greatest of the Dutch radical critics, who said that he believed that the Pauline epistles presuppose complex debates later on in the history of Paulinism. None of them were actually written by Paul, which is what I think, too. He convinced me. And that Acts is also a later embellishment, but that it does depend upon an early, very brief, so he called Acts of Paul, which survives in the canonical Acts of the Apostles in the form of Paul's itinerary. But it presupposed that he was a preacher of Jewish Christianity. As I think, what's his name? Watson suggests in his book, Paul something or other, Mission to the Nations or something, I forget now, where he says he thinks Paul was originally a preacher of circumcision, but it just wasn't going over big with the Gentile audiences, and so he decided, well, do we really need this, and cut it out. But Van Manen said, yeah, there had been an earlier, much more rudimentary Acts of Paul that didn't look a whole lot like either the Paul of Acts, the canonical Acts, or of the epistles. That's kind of, though of course this wouldn't be Marcionite, right, because Paul would be a preacher of Jewish Christianity. Okay, the other scholar is Charles Cutler Torrey, Torrey, in his book, something like the composition of the book of Acts, or the composition of the Acts of the Apostles. I'm sorry, I'm losing it here with these titles. You could find this, a reprint of it, as I did, on Amazon. Just look up Charles Cutler Torrey, or C.C. Torrey, Torrey. And he says, he thinks that linguistically it appears that Acts chapters 1 through 15 were originally a self-sufficient Aramaic document, and he dubs it First Acts, and that it was translated into Greek by whoever then went on to write chapters 16 through 28. And of course, following David Trobisch and Stefan Hermann Huller, I think that was Polycarp. And that gets a little closer to Marcionite territory, though not all the way, because you have the pretty much the Paul versus Peter, or Paul and Peter parallel system that Bauer made so much of in the first versus second acts, if you want to divide it up that way. So I would certainly recommend Van Manen and Torrey on that. Again, neither says exactly what you're asking about, but both of them are in the ballpark. I don't know of anyone else who says that. In fact, okay, enough said on that. Is there evidence for a violent as opposed to pacifistic Jesus? Well, yes, again, Brandon and Eisler and others have argued that Jesus would have been a revolutionary messianic king, like Athronges, the shepherd king, and Menachem, and Simon Bar Gioris, and so forth. And partly that's based on pronounced similarities between Jesus, though it's kind of covered up, and Josephus's accounts of these messianic revolutionaries. There are hints that Eisler and Brandon and others picked up on, like at the Last Supper, Jesus says, whoever does not have a sword, let him sell his cloak and buy one. And the disciples, at least a couple of them, are already armed, and they say, Lord, here are 2 swords. And he says, that's enough, which people usually take to mean, okay, enough said, that's it, forget it, that they just didn't understand. But I don't think that's quite the point. He's saying that ought to do it. That ought to be enough. For what? Well, traditionally we think of the Jesus disciples starting a fight with the arresting party in the garden. Simply, whatever they intended, God intended it for the fulfillment of prophecy. He was numbered with the transgressors, so let's make him look like one even though he isn't. And that's followed up by a framing and Jesus' erroneous crucifixion as a rebel against Rome, the king of the Jews. But think about the fact that the disciples are trying to offer armed resistance to the arrest of Jesus. That's not some play acting thing. And that he does get crucified as a rebel, and the Romans crucify him. Jews don't get authorization, that is, from Rome to stone him themselves, which you'd think they would do if it was simply a prophetic religious problem between Jesus and them. And more serious than that, the cleansing of the temple, as we call it. As Brandon points out, if this happened, maybe it didn't, but if it happened, it has to have been much more of a big deal than Mark makes it out to be. I mean, Mark gives you the idea Jesus has burst into some local church, gone down to the basement where they're having a rummage sale, and knocked over the folding tables that were laden with copies of Reader's Digest, condensed books, and stuff like that, right? No, the extent of the court of the Gentiles was vast, and Mark actually says he wouldn't allow anyone to carry the sacrificial vessels back through the temple. Well, that's got to mean that he has armed men guarding the doorways. I mean, there's no other way to understand that. Of course, Burton Mack says that nothing happened at all. It's just worked up from prophecies and all that, and is retrojecting the siege of Jerusalem 40 years earlier. That might be true. But if anything happened, it had to be a revolutionary act with armed men. And then there's that saying of Jesus from Q: the kingdom of God advances with violence, and violent men seize it by force, and so forth. So yeah, you bet there's evidence for that. Given the embarrassment of riches, although some of the riches are probably counterfeit, and maybe most of them, maybe all of them, it's a little tough to be sure, but there certainly is evidence for that. Well, let's see. Here's a goodie. Where did the risen Jesus get the clothes he was wearing? After all, they parted his garments and all that stuff. He would have had at most a loincloth, if that, on the cross. We're told that Joseph of Arimathea wrapped him in linen strips or in a linen sindon, a one-piece shroud. The Gospels don't agree on that. And that is left behind when Jesus rises. So when he appears to others, is he naked, or is he like the Terminator, that he took people's clothes when he strolled away from the tomb or something? I guess that's possible, but nothing like that is assumed. Like, that would imply the first appearance of the risen Son of God was at somebody's clothesline trying to bum a suit off him, right? It's absurd. It's the same kind of silliness we read in the Transfiguration story, right, where Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus. How is it that Peter recognizes these two guys whom he can never have seen? He can never even seen an artist's depiction because no images, right? Well, of course, Mark doesn't think about that. He just says, well, I know they're Moses and Elijah because I'm the one that put them there, and so my characters know who they are. Whoops. Yeah, it just shows the literary, not historical character of the whole thing. Or the same goof is made in Mark chapter 5 with the Gerasene or Gadarene demoniac. He's stark naked, living in the cemetery, and after Jesus exorcises the legion of demons, the townspeople come and see him dressed and in his right mind. I did a sermon on this once called Sharp Dressed Man. And where did he get the clothes? What is one of the disciples huddling naked, having given him his tunic or whatever? He just didn't think it out, right? So it's the same kind of... I don't mean to ridicule the stories. I'm just trying to show they are stories, right? And this is one of the ways you can tell. Should we assume that the book of Revelation was written by a follower of Marcionite Christianity, since the book talks about secret knowledge being passed on to favored disciples? Well, of course, the Synoptic Gospels do that too, right? Where Jesus is giving the Olivet Discourse, at least in Matthew and Mark, only to a select inner circle of disciples. That's probably some kind of hint of a Gnostic or some kind of pseudepigraphical origin. Now, why didn't everybody else know this? Why would he have kept it secret? Well, no reason is given, but the one you have to infer is that it's a way of explaining why nobody else had ever heard this until it got blabbed. Same thing with the Transfiguration story. Same thing with the empty tomb story. And so on. But there are various signs of at least encretism. And all this stuff about the secret name that no one else will know. There is some Gnostic stuff. Gnosticism, at least partly, grows out of Jewish scribalism and apocalypticism, and there is this privileged knowledge thing. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is a number of a particular man. You know who I mean. Well, that's, Gnosticism is on a pretty short continuum with all of that stuff. But Marcionite, I don't think so. If anything, it is Jewish Christian and anti-Marcionite. And in fact, when it speaks in the first 3 chapters somewhere about the synagogue of Satan, what is that? Well, of course, it wasn't actually a Satanist group. There was no Satanism in the ancient world. And what they mean is they think they're really a worshiping synagogue, just like the Nicolaitans or Jezebel or whoever is preaching the deep things of Satan. Well, of course, that's not what they said. They're Gnostics, like the Nicolaitans certainly were Gnostics. And so, again, there's some reference to it. But the synagogue of Satan might refer to Marcionites because they called their meeting places synagogues. It was just a Greek word meaning an assembly place, a meeting hall. Nero, and Hellenistic Jews use the same word, right? So, but Paul is not mentioned in the book of Revelation, and when the New Jerusalem descends, the 12 gates are named for the 12 apostles. No room for Paul there. So I think F.C. Bauer already said this seems to be non-Pauline or anti-Pauline, and that would mean anti-Marcion as well. So yeah, I think there is Gnosticism. In fact, one of my wacky theories is that the apocalypse of the seven thunders, which John writes down and then is told by the angel, no, censor that. I think that is a reference to the Gnostic texts from Nag Hammadi, thunder perfect mind. But I'll leave you to the introduction to that book in my pre-Nicene New Testament to go further. Let me see. Also, speaking of, the same questioner says, what is the latest critical analysis on the author and time period of Revelation? Well, I guess the latest might be Margaret Barker's, who I believe places it during the war with Rome in the late 60s, early 70s, CE or AD if you prefer. I am ashamed to say I've not yet read that book, though I love her work and hope to get to it before too long. But others have thought that at least chapter 11, the little scroll, dates from the time of the Emperor Nero. But most, I think, go along with Irenaeus, who said that it was written in the 90s during the time of the Emperor Domitian, and that he is the great beast. And even though the number of the beast is code for Neron Caesar, but the prevalent belief was that Nero had escaped assassination by his own guards, and escaped across the Euphrates to Parthia, the great enemy of Rome, and that he would come back as the great beast, and that he would have been one of the 7 heads of the dragon, but also the 10th, and therefore he was literally, he was Nero, and Domitian was his return, either literally or figuratively. So the Nero stuff doesn't necessarily point to the time of the historical Nero. There were several people that turned up sooner or later claiming to be Nero. We know of several of them. So this thing that Irenaeus tells us about the Nero redivivus thing, that has the ring of truth about it. Speaking of Margaret Barker and the book of Revelation, someone here asks what I think about her understanding that in the title of it, this is the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to tell his servants what must come to pass. Margaret thinks that Jesus himself was an apocalyptic visionary, as witness her fascinating book, The Risen Lord, the historical Jesus as the Christ of faith, where she says Jesus really said this stuff, not only in the Gospels, at least some of it, but even some of the Nag Hammadi stuff, that he was a Gnostic revealer. I mean, there were Gnostic revealers, right? That doesn't necessarily... that's not a fictitious notion. And so that Jesus had these revelations and passed them on to John. I don't yet know, again, I've not yet read the book, whether Margaret thinks that the I saw this and that refers to Jesus, that was already in the text. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised. I'll have to check that out. What the heck's her name? Barbara Thiering says something similar to that in her book, Jesus of the Apocalypse. I think that could certainly be, but it seems to me that is an unnecessary hypothesis, because I tend to interpret the text of Revelation by the text of Revelation, and it seems to me to be nearer at hand to take that passage I just quoted, the revelation which God gave Jesus Christ, to refer to the scene, I think in chapter 4, where the Lamb that was slain, who sits on the throne, is handed the seven-sealed book and begins to open it and to reveal the future. I think that is the revelation of Jesus Christ that God gave him, literally handed to him in chapter 4. But who knows? I got to read that book. Anything she writes is amazingly eye-opening. Let's see. Somebody notes that the Jehovah's Witnesses, they have depicted Jesus in different ways over the years, and that back in the early 50s, they explained that they pictured Jesus with short hair and clean shaven because that's the way the earliest Christian depictions of him look. However, most scholars think that's because they're just borrowing the current image of Apollo. But later on, about 20 years later, the witnesses still have him with short hair but with a beard. That's interesting because and they say that's scriptural, but of course there's no reference to Jesus being bearded. Chances are he would be, I suppose. But I think they get that because Christians have always thought this, I think it's an Isaiah passage, is a prediction of Jesus where it says, I gave my back to the smiters and my cheeks to those who pluck out the beard. Well, okay, he must have had a beard. Of course, that's exactly what's happening. That's a great case of what mythicists think happened with early Christians building the image of a historical Jesus. That we know what Jesus supposedly did by reading the New Testament. They knew what he did by reading the Old, and that Jesus was a kind of a concoction of these Old Testament and other motifs. That'd be a classic case of it. Now here's something else I hadn't thought of. In Luke 1:32, the angel tells Mary how she will give birth to a son who will be the heir to David, even though she does not know a man. Doesn't that imply that Mary is of Davidic lineage? Now, this becomes part of this Roman Catholic apologetic that some Protestants like to use too, where they say Luke's genealogy, though it's stated to be the genealogy of Joseph, is really that of Mary. Of course, this is an attempt to harmonize Luke with Matthew, who has a totally different genealogy of Joseph. That seems crazy. Jacob Neusner, the great authority on ancient Judaism, says he's never heard of such a thing. And indeed, it would be hopelessly confusing to attribute the woman's genealogy to her husband. I mean, it would lead to the same kind of confusion people have always had with the two genealogies of Jesus, right? But take it as it stands only in the Annunciation of the angel Gabriel. There's not going to be a human father, so where does he get the Davidic DNA? Mustn't it be from Mary? That's pretty good. I tend to think, though, that Luke has in mind the fact that she will be marrying a guy who is of Davidic lineage, as witnessed by the taxation census. It's Joseph who has to go to Bethlehem because King David, his ancestor, lived there. Now, it's still possible that Luke thought Mary was of Davidic lineage, though I think the fact that Elizabeth is her cousin and is married to a Levite priest, that sort of implies she too is a Levite, though it doesn't demand it, and it certainly doesn't say it. But it seems to me that Luke is saying, okay, that he's the adopted son, so to speak, of a Davidic heir, namely Joseph. But that raises a further difficulty. If it was important that the Messiah be descended from David, would anybody have taken it seriously as a fulfillment of that if your guy was not a blood descendant of David? I can't think so. I cannot believe that would have been good enough. Whence all of this mess? I mean, was he actually Joseph's son and all that stuff? Well, there are these little jogs in the narrative, like so-and-so and so-and-so begat Joseph, who was the husband of Mary, who bore Jesus. Wait a minute, you mean it's not the genealogy of Jesus? It looks like somebody has added this little thing, this distancing device, that originally it said, so-and-so begat Joseph, who begat Jesus. And in fact, and Matthew has the same sort of a thing. Who was the Joseph who was, as supposed, the father of Jesus. Sounds like both of them are trying to harmonize genealogies, which made Jesus the direct offspring of Joseph, with their miraculous birth narratives where he wasn't, even though it destroys the whole Davidic lineage thing. You're trying to have your cake and eat it too. But you got a very interesting point. Okay, then finally, is there any evidence that is anywhere near contemporary that Paul actually persecuted the Christians? Well, of course, there's evidence, right? There is data, but you have to weigh that data. And I think that John C. O'Neill made a very good case that the Galatians stuff, for instance, and others too, where Paul speaks of his having been a persecutor of the church, is all interpolation. I recommend, what's it called? I think The Recovery of Paul's Epistle to the Galatians by O'Neill. He also wrote a great commentary on Romans, showing that a whole lot of it is very likely in later interpolation. The stuff in the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, about the persecution, well, that's pseudepigraphical for sure. And that's just reflects somebody figured, that's part of the story of Paul. And so that can be discounted. The 3 accounts of Paul's conversion in the book of Acts are literary in origin, not historical, because they bear undeniable signs of having been rewritten from 2 very well-known sources, the Bacchae of Euripides, where King Pentheus is persecuting the followers of the new Dionysus sect, and until he is miraculously converted to believe in it and then martyred. And then on the other hand, 2 Maccabees chapter 3, where Heliodorus, an agent of Antiochus Epiphanes, comes to loot the Jerusalem temple and has the stuffing beaten out of him by some angels, and this converts him to Judaism, and so forth. And there's so many parallels that it just seems to me, Luke didn't have any historical information. I think the whole thing came from a reinterpretation / misinterpretation of the claim of early Jewish, that is pro-Torah Christians, when they said, this guy, Paul, who teaches that the Torah is over with, that's absurd. He's denying the word of God. He's a false prophet, a false apostle, an antichrist. He opposes Christianity and those who believe in it. Of course, by Christianity, they meant true Christianity, their version of Christianity. People still, fog the issue over that way. Oh, we're the real Christians. Are you a Catholic or are you a Christian? What, wasn't Catholicism part of Christianity? Well, not in the eyes of some Protestants, right? So the claim of Jewish Christians that Paul warred against the truth, against Christianity, and therefore against them, came later to be innocently but polemically misunderstood as Paul actually persecuting, torturing, jailing people who believed in Christianity per se. I think it was a mistake, and that's how it came about. Plus, as Henkin points out in his great commentary on Acts, the role of Paul in the stoning of Stephen seems to be artificial, because the notion that the Sanhedrin sent him to Damascus to persecute people, the Sanhedrin and the high priest had no such authority. And Luke's trying to build up, or Polycarp's trying to build up this legend of Paul as the persecutor. And then when in Galatians, what does Paul say, or whoever, I think it's an interpolation, those in Jerusalem when he went there had heard of me but never seen my face. How's that if he was associated, as Acts says, with a persecution starting with Stephen? So, yeah, I think that there is evidence that is relevant data, but whether it is true or not is the question, and I don't think it is. Okay, thanks for being with me on the Bible Geek. I have copies of Moses and Minimalism to be autographed and sent to you for a donation of 20 smackers. I sure could use it around here, the Price family. And thank you for your generosity and your interest in the Bible Geek. So I'll be doing another one soon, just for you. So see you then.